Under the communications system established by the American Navy, messages were coded and further protected. It might be possible for a bright Japanese code expert to break a code, given enough repetitions of the same word or the same sequence. One protective device was the padding of messages. It was quite routine. The message was sent down to the communications center for coding and transmission. The communications officer set it up for coding thus: Turkey trots to water X, where is Task Force 34X, the whole world wonders. Morrison says this message was never sent. The source is Halsey's story. Now the first phrase of the message was obviously meaningless, and it was excised by the receiving communications men on Halsey's New Jersey when it came in. The third phrase was also meaningless, and it should also have been excised. But the Halsey communications men were not sure it was meaningless, because it could be construed to be meaningful in connection with the second phrase, and so the third phrase, not so carefully added, was carefully retained, and Halsey was thrown into a swivet. He turned his flagship around, abandoned the chase, took Bogan's Task Group 38.2 and the fast battleships, and headed south at flank speed, knowing that he could not arrive before 0800 on October 26th. Mitcher, with Sherman and Davison and their task groups, was left to do what damage he could to the Ozawa force. Later, Admiral Halsey said that the one aspect of the Battle of the Philippines that he regretted was this decision, made in anger against Nimitz and Kinkaid, to turn south and abandon his chance to destroy Ozawa's force. A newspaper wag, following the action, christened it the Battle of Bull's Run, Bull Halsey being the name the correspondents had hung on him because of his ferocious statements about the Japanese and what he was going to do to them. So the Battle of Bull's Run began, and with it some second-guessing by many people. At Pearl Harbor, where he was planning the invasion of Iwo Jima, Admiral Spruance stood beside the map of the Philippines and put his hand alongside the San Bernardino Strait. "If I were there, I would keep my force right there," he said. Kinkaid's attitude shone through in his messages, and forever afterward Kinkaid took the position that Halsey was supposed to have guarded San Bernardino Strait for him. In Leyte Gulf, the transports and the amphibious forces that morning were not considering the finer points of naval tactics and strategy. Admiral Wilkinson was aboard his amphibious command ship in that gulf, watching the fighting going on around him, and as he wrote Kelly Turner later, "I certainly felt like the heroine shrinkingly watching the hero and the villain fight for her possession." In Washington, Admiral King was in his office. Rear Admiral Jocko Clark, who happened to be in Washington that day, stopped to pay a call on the Commander-in-Chief. He found King pacing the office, furious. Halsey had left San Bernardino open for the Japanese to hit the transports at Leyte, said King, and he so far forgot his sense of seniority as to lambast his absent fleet commander. But in Nimitz's headquarters thought was much more restrained, and so was conversation. Chester Nimitz, Jr., happened to be visiting his father at Pearl Harbor that day, for the first and only time during the war, since young Nimitz's submarine duty had kept him almost entirely in the South and Southwest Pacific. Mildly but firmly, Nimitz was blaming Halsey for leaving the strait unguarded and not keeping Kinkaid informed. His son could dare where others might not, and he asked to see Halsey's orders. When he examined the operation orders issued at Pearl Harbor, young Nimitz spoke up. "It's your fault," he told his father. He pointed to the orders, which specifically gave Halsey the right to move out against the Japanese fleet if he had an opportunity to smash major elements. The orders were a reflection of the Sherman-Riley discussions. "That's your opinion," said Chester Nimitz Sr. to Chester Nimitz Jr., and that was the end of the discussion. The rest was left to give the naval historians of the future something to think about. Zuikaku was sunk, and the carrier battleship Ise was hit. Zuiho was hit again and sunk. Cruisers of the task group sank the Chiyoda, which was lying dead in the water, and the destroyer Hatsuzuki. Admiral Lockwood's submarines started closing in on the Japanese force, and Jalao sank the damaged cruiser Tama. But Ise, Hyuga, Oyodo, and 5 destroyers made it safely home, which they certainly would not have done had Halsey pressed on when he was 50 miles from the Ozawa force with his fast battleships. Those battleships arrived off San Bernardino Strait and caught the injured destroyer Nowake of the Kurita force, which was limping far behind Kurita. They smashed Nowake and picked up some survivors from Suzuya, but otherwise the fast battleships were the victims of faulty communications and changed decision. They left the northern fight and arrived too late for the southern one. Whose fault was it that Kinkaid was given such a fright? That the escort carrier Gambier Bay was sunk and the gallant destroyers took their lumps? The facts would seem to indicate that if there is fault to be found, it must be distributed. Admiral King could be faulted for permitting, insisting on, a divided command, with Halsey retaining his independence of movement, yet supporting MacArthur's navy, which was Kinkaid's 7th Fleet. Nimitz could be faulted for not making it clear to Halsey that he was responsible for protection of the amphibious forces, tactically, and letting Halsey believe that he was a free agent if he had a chance to hit the Japanese heavy fleet units. Halsey could be faulted for not knowing or finding out that the Kurita force was as strong as it was, and that it was still coming. Of course, like everyone else in the Pacific in 1944, Halsey was supercarrier conscious, and as the Japanese strategists had figured, the 4 carriers plus the battleship carriers were just too much for a carrier admiral to pass up. Kinkaid could be faulted for not finding the Japanese on the night of October 24th or in the early light of October 25th and bringing up Oldendorf's battleships. But why fault, except to learn for the future? It was a tremendous victory, even if it might have been more tremendous. The Japanese General Staff was more generous to the Americans than they were to themselves. The Japanese said their navy was destroyed at the Philippines. What the victory meant was very clearly mirrored in Secretary Forrestal's office that day. On October 25th, Kinkaid and Halsey both began sending messages indicating the damage they had caused the Japanese fleet, but these were accompanied by the messages about the attacks on the escort carriers. But at around noon, Halsey sent a signal to Nimitz, which was intercepted at the Navy Department. "You can say with confidence and assurance," Halsey said, "the Japanese Navy has been beaten, routed, and broken." King was still angry. He radioed Nimitz to hold up the substance of that message because, King said, Halsey had not had a chance to make a complete evaluation of the situation. Forrestal agreed. "It seemed to me it was wiser to be certain even at the risk of losing 2 or 3 hours in announcing the news." King gave a press conference at 3 p.m. showing great confidence and indicating that the Japanese fleet was engaged, but not saying much specifically. Forrestal recalls, "Just before the press conference, I had talked to the President and called his attention to Halsey's message. Just after the conference came the word of Reuters' story on MacArthur's broadcast of the victory. Harry Hopkins called up and asked what I thought about releasing Halsey's message. I said I was for it, subject to 2 things. First, a paraphrase to protect the integrity of our codes. Second, my general superstition about releasing good news until we were absolutely certain of its correctness. However, Hopkins said he thought it was worth taking a chance, so around 6 o'clock the President called in the White House reporters and read them a paraphrase of Halsey's dispatch to Nimitz. And that message is part of the reason why Halsey was a successful admiral. Beyond the immediate problem of the battle, which was really not so humorous as to earn its title, the Battle of Bull's Run, Halsey could see that the Japanese had adopted desperate tactics. With their decimated navy, they could only try to achieve a surprise in a 3-pronged attack. Once that failed, and the remnants of the fleet were sent limping back to imperial waters, the navy was no more. To be sure, Halsey, above all American fighters in the Pacific, would have loved to have a straight chance at the traditional Nelsonian battle of fleet to fleet to slug it out with the enemy. But such was not to be. It was never really in the cards. The Japanese knew from the beginning that they would have to win their war by smash and grab and then hold the areas they had captured, to create so much trouble that the West would tire of the conflict and come to terms suitable to Japan. Halsey was quick to see, and quick to say, that the Battle of the Philippine Sea represented the last dying gasp of a once proud fleet. From that moment on, the Americans could move anywhere in the Pacific without much worry. If recriminations were in order over the operations of October 24-26, 1944, there was very little time for them in the first days of November. The Japanese fleet was no longer a problem, and never would be again in the war, but Japanese air power was very far from finished. Planes could be flown in along the island-hopping route, and they were flown in large numbers. Many were converted to kamikaze operation, and this suicide club offered the greatest threat to the forces at sea since the days of Guadalcanal. At the end of October, Mark Mitcher went home for a rest, and Admiral McCain took over as commander of Task Force 38. It was now understood that Mitcher would operate with Spruance and McCain would work with Halsey. Early in November, Halsey put his finger on the major problem of command in the Philippines. Nimitz had chided him gently for leaving San Bernardino Strait. Said Nimitz in effect that Halsey must remember that the Leyte operation could not be allowed to fail, and therefore everything must be done to make it a success. Halsey replied, "I quite understand that the Leyte operation must not fail and will be guided accordingly until we are released, but there are factors which I feel that I must report to you, factors that seem to me to be in violation of every sound principle of command. In the first place, having two autonomous tactical fleet commands supporting the same operation cannot be justified from a naval viewpoint. Cooperation can never be a substitute for command in a naval action, and the further employment of the Seventh Fleet in conjunction with but separate and independent from the Pacific Fleet has all the elements of confusion, if not disaster." Looking ahead, Halsey spoke of the coming operation in which MacArthur would move up the Philippines. "I don't know what you could do about it, but it would be a great break if a Pac Fleet expeditionary force could be set up to put the army ashore at Lingayen and thus keep centralized naval control of things until the army says they can take care of themselves ashore." The last few days at Leyte have been confusing. Under MacArthur's system, the Air, Army and Navy are three separate commands on the same level. Under that system, no one agency really runs the show, because GHQ is not geared to exercise operational control. On November 9th, Halsey repeated this complaint and amplified it. "I greatly admire MacArthur's fighting qualities," he said, but he still complained about the command setup. The weakness showed up at Leyte. Weiler, commander of the North Fire Support Unit, could get no information. There were no properly organized searches. Weiler reported failure by the Army to provide the promised CAP, Combat Air Patrol. Kincaid reported only 60 fighters at Leyte, although more could have been accommodated. The Tokyo Express visited the west coast of Leyte with impunity, and all because neither GHQ nor any other agency coordinates and manages all weapons engaged in the overall operation. Nothing could better demonstrate the need for an expeditionary force under naval command. Halsey was discussing the last few days, which had been most difficult. On October 30th, kamikazes hit the carriers Franklin and Belleau Wood, causing enough damage that they had to retire to Ulithi for repairs. Admiral Weiler's force, he was left as senior officer at Leyte Gulf for the 7th Fleet, was badly hit because of the air failure on the land. One destroyer was sunk by kamikazes on November 1st, and 4 were damaged. Kincaid asked MacArthur for land-based air support or more help from Halsey. It had to be help from Halsey. The Army air was not yet much in evidence. Halsey had plenty of trouble. The cruiser Reno was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine and had to be towed to Ulithi. So Halsey got permission from Nimitz to make a series of airstrikes on Luzon, where the kamikazes were originating. On November 5th, Task Force 38 hit Luzon hard, claiming 439 planes destroyed in a 2-day strike. The carrier planes also sank the heavy cruiser Nachi, a survivor of the Battle of Surigao Strait. But Lexington, the new one, took a kamikaze on the starboard side of the island and was hit badly enough that McCain transferred his flag to Wasp. Still, the pressure on Leyte was sharply reduced. Nimitz was pleased. He noted the high cost, but he remarked that Halsey was inflicting attrition on the enemy at a gratifying rate. Halsey had wanted very much to hit the Japanese islands in November and had secured permission from Nimitz for Operation Hotfoot, until the pressure came back on from the renewed Japanese Air Force. The carriers simply could not be spared until MacArthur could build airfields and get land-based air into Leyte. In the middle of the month, the carriers hit Luzon, sinking a light cruiser, 5 destroyers and 7 transports, at a loss of 25 planes for 84 Japanese planes. This was indeed healthy attrition. On November 25th, planes from Bogan's and Sherman's carriers sank the heavy cruiser Kumano. But that day, kamikazes hit carriers Intrepid and Cabot hard, and Admiral Bogan had to go back to Ulithi with his task group for repairs. At the end of November, King and Nimitz met again to discuss the affairs of the fleet. Halsey had been at sea for 3 months, which was a long time to hold operational command of a fighting fleet without a rest. King suggested at these meetings that Halsey ought to have a 2-month rest on the mainland at the earliest opportunity. That thinking accorded with the private plans Nimitz had already discussed with Halsey, to have him come out of battle at the end of the year. But another matter came up, ever so delicately, at these meetings, the composition of Halsey's staff. There was a lingering feeling in Washington and at Pearl Harbor that Halsey's staff was not all it should be. When Halsey went ashore, Nimitz thought, was the time to look into staff changes. King and Nimitz, along with Leahy, were waiting then for the passage by Congress of a bill creating a new naval rank, Admiral of the Fleet, with the understanding that they would soon be appointed to such posts. If and when that happened, King said, perhaps he ought to make Kincaid a full admiral, to even up the fleet commands. On an inspection trip to the Pacific that fall, Towers had been unfavourably impressed by Hoover, who was an outspoken and driving character. Towers had made a firm recommendation that Hoover be replaced, partly on the basis of his impression of Hoover's personality, partly because of the running feud between Hoover and General Hale. The recommendation was heard, and Nimitz squashed the move. He wanted Hoover to continue in his job. The friction between Hoover and Hale, he said, was doubtless due to Hoover's driving qualities and his attempts to make an unwilling Army Air Force move out on shipping strikes, which they believed were a waste of time and talent. Nimitz was well aware of the animosity between Towers and Hoover. In October, Towers had returned to complain about many aspects of the forward areas. Too much luxury for Hoover and his staff, too much trouble with Hale, too little attention to civil affairs. Nimitz had called on Hoover to explain, and on October 5th, Hoover had written him in detail, naming Towers as the complainant and answering the complaints. Of course, there was bound to be complaint about Hoover. Lieutenant Commander McArdle, who was assigned to Hoover that fall as public relations officer, described him thus. Admiral Hoover was not the most popular admiral in the Pacific. He was harsh and exacting, a perfectionist. If the 7th AAF's bombing of Iwo Jima didn't suit him, one time he concluded that too many of the liberators were turning back from engine trouble without reaching their target. He would sit down and write a terse 10-word message blistering the pants off the Army Air Force and send it to General Hale. Or he would have an orderly call General Hale's orderly and ask the general to call Admiral Hoover. The admiral never called a subordinate direct, and it wasn't always the Army Air Force that caught it. An island commander, a CB unit, a Navy port director, any of these could become the target of the scathing invective, delivered in a calm, almost silken voice that could send chills down the spines of strong men. McArdle enjoyed his stay on Saipan with Hoover, or rather on the Curtis, the Admiral's flagship. The beds were good, and the food was the best in the Pacific. The Admiral treated himself well. The ship was the former yacht of millionaire Cyrus Curtis. They had springs in their bunks, always clean linen, ice cream every afternoon, and almost immediately on reaching Saipan, an officers' club on Maniagasa Island. That idea didn't work so well. Some officer carelessly threw a cigarette butt. It landed in a Japanese ammunition dump concealed in a cave, and the officer and dump were blown to kingdom come. But there were always the boats, in which beer could be drunk on the reefs, not on shipboard. And there was the tennis court. The old man, as his staff called him, was in his 50s and a bug for tennis. So wherever the Curtis would wander, The Seabees would follow with rollers and equipment to build the Admiral's hard-surface tennis court. Nimitz had heard all the tales. He was very fond of Hoover and intensely loyal to him, and Hoover was doing his best in a most unenjoyable job for a sailor, management of shore facilities and shore people, in addition to shore-based air. Hoover did an excellent job. This loyalty of Nimitz's was an interesting facet of his character, as has been seen, and a piece with all the rest. As long as an officer did not offend higher authority and remained in Nimitz's good books by good performance of duty, the Admiral would protect him from all the curves thrown by the Army, the Marine Corps, or even the man's peers. Thus Hoover, whose personality and activity offended Admiral Towers and various Army generals, could be safe under the protective mantle of the Pacific Command. But a Fletcher, or a Brown, or a Drake, or a Moore who had gotten under the skin of someone higher on the totem pole could not be saved by Nimitz. Even less diplomatic commanders like Halsey and Spruance had learned that personal loyalty in the Navy system had its limitations. Spruance had been forced to transfer Captain Moore, his chief of staff, because of King's dislike for the man. Halsey, the rebel, fought tooth and nail to hold on to Browning, his chief of staff, but to no avail. In sparing himself such useless strain, Nimitz was far more judicious. The Admiral was an expert in his own public relations. He never offended higher authority uselessly, and to him uselessly would mean going to bat for someone in serious personal trouble. That was the ancient Navy system. Nimitz had said at the outset of the war that he preferred to let Admiral Jacobs, the personnel director, have the say on senior officers. Thus Nimitz avoided the responsibility for personnel changes throughout the war. It was a wise course and an effective one. Halsey was quite the opposite. He would fight like a tiger for his men. True, he would be quick to ship out an officer who goofed up or who displayed disloyalty to him, but an officer who was loyal and was doing his job could do no wrong with Halsey. He proved that successfully in the case of Scrappy Kessing, who was very nearly a victim of the Navy bureaucracy. And yet the limitations of loyalty are indicated in the cases of both Halsey's and Spruance's personal choices as Chief of Staff. Halsey had Browning, who fitted him very well, but Browning somehow antagonized the Secretary of the Navy at Noumea, and from that point on King put constant pressure on Halsey until Browning was moved out. Spruance liked Captain Moore, who was the ideal Chief of Staff for him because Moore was hard-working and detail-conscious, so exacting and so able that Spruance could be lazy, Moore's word, about detail. But Moore had antagonized King, and thus he had to go. Moore could not even be promoted or have the sop of a Distinguished Service Medal. Spruance and Moore talked over Moore's problem many times, but Spruance was wise enough to refuse to keep butting his head against the stone wall of King's resistance, and thus call down the Furies on himself. It was the Navy way, and if Halsey defied the way from time to time, it did him precious little good, and only his tremendous ability as a commander and a fighting admiral saved him from the wrath of his superiors. Nimitz's course, then, was that of a very judicious man. At this particular set of King Nimitz conferences, in November 1944, there were other personnel matters to be decided, and Nimitz made several recommendations, indicating his manner of dealing with King and with Jacobs, who sat in on this part of the discussion. Rear Admiral George D. Murray, who had taken over Towers's old job as commander of the Air Forces of the Pacific, was to be advanced to Vice Admiral, Nimitz's recommendation. Rear Admiral William D. Sample, one of the carrier group commanders in Kincaid's 7th Fleet, had been wounded while flying over Leyte. King wanted to know why. Was Sample out joyriding over the Japanese lines, which would have gotten him fired, or was he there to observe the position of the Japanese, which might get him a medal? Nimitz promised to look into this matter, so it went, Nimitz exercising restraint on King at times. King wanted to relieve Fletcher as commander of the North Pacific Force, and Nimitz gently demurred. It was not important enough for King to pursue. Little was happening in the North Pacific, and in this degree Nimitz exercised an influence. Nimitz suggested that Captain Austin, his assistant chief of staff for administration, be made a commodore, and King approved. They discussed the very ticklish question of the case known as Smith versus Smith, Holland Smith's decision to relieve Major General Ralph Smith of the Army 27th Division at Saipan. The Smith case was still boiling, and the Army had chosen to make a very serious issue of it on the Holland-Smith level. General Marshall was very angry. He had already made the flat statement that never again would an Army general serve under the Marines, and now the official buttressing of this position was underway. Marshall had written King on the subject in November, asking King to straighten out the matter between Nimitz and General Richardson. Marshall had also asked that Navy public relations be chided for allowing articles to be published that will cause friction between the services, quite forgetting the articles the Army had fed the press just after the incident. Marshall was not aware that Nimitz had flatly refused to make any statement in the interests of Army-Navy amity. Characteristically, Nimitz made no mention of this decision. It was decided earlier and affirmed here that in the coming operations against Iwo Jima no Army troops would be used, and thus there could be no arguments. Holland Smith would be in charge at Iwo Jima. What would happen after that was yet to be decided. There were at this time long discussions of the Allies and potential allies in the war against Japan. The British wanted to participate, which would create problems outside the Australia-New Zealand area, as far as logistics was concerned. The Russians were talking about coming into the war, and King noted that Mr. Stalin had asked for 3 months stockpiling in Siberia in preparation for their entry into the war against Japan. In addition, Mr. Stalin said that 3 months after the war with Germany, ends would be necessary to build up the 30 to 40 Russian divisions in Siberia to 60 divisions. Once again, the discussion turned to strategy in the Pacific. Nimitz presented plans for Operation Long Tom, which would be an invasion of the Chushan archipelago. King liked the idea, as a preliminary to the invasion of Kyushu, which was then tentatively scheduled for mid-September 1945, followed by a December invasion of the Tokyo Plain. For the first time, serious talk was begun about post-war plans, personnel, bases, sea frontiers, and logistics. It was almost eerie that these top commanders were able to consider the war on so many levels, those of operations, tactics, strategy, post-war planning, and internal administration of the Navy, all in one meeting. Months before, when the news of the casualties at Tarawa had brought Nimitz scores of angry letters from mothers who accused him of sending their sons to their deaths, and wives who called him murderer, Nimitz had said sorrowfully, "This is one of the responsibilities of command. You have to send some people to their death." With equal aplomb, he could now discuss a plan by Halsey in the South China Sea and the number of Army troops in the Pacific who might be used for operations against the enemy. In the November meetings, King and Nimitz agreed that in the future 2 of the Third Fleet's fast carrier task groups ought to be at rest at Ulithi, while the other 2 were in operation, and late in November Halsey did come into port. 2 weeks later he was out in the Pacific again, striking the island of Mindoro in connection with MacArthur's move up the Philippines. On December the 17th, Halsey and his force were steaming along in stormy weather, about 500 miles east of Luzon, standing out from their operations to refuel at sea. It was typhoon season in these waters, and by mid-morning Halsey knew he was facing something more than an ordinary storm. Checking with his aerographer, he decided to move 200 miles to the northwest. Unfortunately, instead of moving away from the storm, he was moving directly toward its center, because the aerographer took the position that the disturbance center was 500 miles east of him, and that it would strike a cold front and turn northeast. Again, communications failures hurt sorely. After Halsey had made his change, he received a delayed dispatch that told him the storm center was not 500 miles east, but 200 miles southeast. He changed the fueling rendezvous, and changed it again. He ran southwest and saw the barometer dropping all the way. The destroyers were very low on fuel. Some of them took in water ballast, some of them did not. The ships began to struggle under mountains of water in vicious seas, some of them 70 feet high. The mighty New Jersey was tossed so that the furniture had to be lashed in place. But the New Jersey could and had taken a shell hit from an enemy ship without Halsey even knowing it. Ships of the fleet, the impact was frightful, and in 3 cases disastrous. The destroyers Spence, Hull, and Monaghan were turned over and sunk. As a child sinks his toy boats in the bathtub by forcing them under the water, so the storm forced these ships over until the water went gurgling down their stacks, and the weight overwhelmed them. Captain Preston Mercer, Nimitz's old flag secretary, was commander of a destroyer squadron. He managed to save his own ship, but could not help some of his others. When the terrible storm was over, 24 men from Spence had been saved, 44 from Hull, and 6 from Monaghan. Later, another 10 from Hull were found. The Third Fleet went back to Ulithi, arriving on December 24th. Captain Mercer called on Admiral Halsey, and they naturally fell to discussing the typhoon. Halsey asked Mercer for his opinions, straight out, and Mercer gave them. There was fault somewhere. "You're damned right," said Halsey. "Somebody ought to be court-martialed for this, either me or the Bureau of Ships." Halsey was referring to various modifications made in the sunken destroyers over a period of time since they had been launched, changes that added more and more weight to the ships above decks and changed their centre of gravity. These modifications had made them top-heavy, or at least not as stable as they had been designed to be. A disaster of the extent of this typhoon demanded an investigation. After all, besides the 3 ships sunk, the cruiser Miami was sorely hurt. So were the light carriers Monterey, Cowpens, and San Jacinto. The escort carriers Cape Esperance and Altamaha were badly damaged, as were the destroyers Aylwin, Dewey, and Hickok, and 19 other ships of the fleet. Nearly 150 planes were lost, 790 men were killed, and 80 were injured. "It was the greatest loss that we have taken in the Pacific without compensatory return since the First Battle of Savo," said Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz came to Ulithi that day bearing a Canadian Christmas tree bedecked with fancy ornaments. He was a little hurt when his thoughtful and generous gesture was not overwhelmingly appreciated by Halsey and the officers of the New Jersey. They were really much prouder of the Christmas tree put together by the men of the crew from pipes and nuts and bolts and other items from the machine shop. Nor was it a very happy Christmas, even with the encouraging tenor of the war. Halsey was facing a court of inquiry, which Nimitz had to order, reluctant as he might be. The court of inquiry was headed by Vice Admiral Hoover, who showed his complete impartiality and devotion to duty by taking a very hard line against America's most famous naval hero. Hoover thought Halsey ought to be court-martialed for letting his fleet get into the way of the typhoon. Others said it was bad staff work again. In the end, Nimitz and King decided that Halsey had been punished enough by the realization that he was responsible, and the matter was resolved by the preparation of a thoroughgoing fleet letter, which set out the facts and the responsibilities, and gave the officers of the fleet instructions in the procedures they should follow in tropical storms of the future. Nimitz went to Ulithi a 5-star admiral. So new was the rank that the sailors of the fleet did not even know how a 5-star admiral's stars were to be arranged, and it took some puzzling to get him a set. Then, when Nimitz went off to see MacArthur with his 5 stars, MacArthur was miffed to discover that Nimitz had the insignia, and he did not. MacArthur aides were summoned to a summit conference that evening and directed to provide the general with 5-star insignia before breakfast. Such problems of command, and some even more important, often tried Nimitz's patience in his relations with General MacArthur. The whole problem of divided authority could be submerged, but it could never be overcome. In January, for example, Admiral Kincaid's 6 old battleships needed some work. 2, in particular, needed major repair of damages suffered in actions since the invasion of Leyte. Nimitz, who owned the battleships as commander of the Pacific Fleet, asked that they be returned to Pearl Harbor. MacArthur refused. He wanted to keep the battleships, he said. He needed them. Thus was a problem posed for Secretary Forrestal, who wrote, "In exercising his prerogatives of command, if he insists on this order, he will, in a sense, be overstepping into the broad authority of Fleet Admiral Nimitz. The units MacArthur needs to accomplish his objectives, that is, the protection of Lingayen Gulf area and the integrity of the supply line, is obviously a thing of vital interest to him, but the determination of when ships need overhaul or may be necessary for other operations is obviously the interest of the commander of the Pacific Ocean areas, Admiral Nimitz. To better meet these new problems of command, Nimitz had decided months before to move to Guam as soon as a headquarters could be readied. Towers had opposed the move strenuously, and why not? He was to be left behind, in a job as deputy commander of the Pacific Fleet, which was to become almost entirely administrative and logistical when all he wanted was a fighting command. At one point Towers' name had been suggested for Calhoun's job as supply admiral, but that idea had fallen by the wayside in the need for someone to keep the Pearl Harbor headquarters going. In January, the Nimitz move began in stages. Guam, in the early days after the capture of the Marianas, had been little but a mud hole. Officers coming into Orote airstrip often had to hitchhike down to Island Command headquarters 8 miles away, and the trip might take them 2 hours. For months there were Japanese loose on the island, roaming about, stealing supplies, taking pot shots at the Seabees, being pot-shotted in turn, and even attending the movies. By January, matters had changed. The Barrigada Mud Trail was on the way to becoming a paved 6-lane highway. At Pacific Fleet Advanced Headquarters, the Seabees were building a town that would have more than 2,500 inhabitants. Nimitz had a white clapboard house with 4 bedrooms and 4 baths, opening onto a courtyard that was landscaped with grass and flowers. There was a large combination living dining room and a screened porch with a view of the lights of the harbour at Agana in the evenings. Next door was a staff cottage, where Admiral Sherman and several of the other senior officers were quartered. Even so, Guam was a dusty place when the sun was hot, and a muddy one when the rains came, which meant nearly every day between January and May. In the beginning, the officers lived in 2-story Quonset huts. When it rained, and the lightning flashed and thunder pounded, the staff was miserable. Down below, the water might compete with the heat for most miserable. Up on Sinkpax Hill, it was better. Guam was a forward headquarters, so the uniform in daytime was khaki shirts and trousers or shorts with no neckties. At night it was tieless khaki. Immediately the reason for the move to Guam was apparent. Where before the coming and going of officers between Pearl Harbor and Brisbane had been a noteworthy event, now movement between Agana and MacArthur's headquarters became commonplace. As for Nimitz, he arose early and went walking before breakfast these days, then ate and went to the office, where he observed much the same routine as in the days at Pearl Harbor. He travelled a little more, time was telescoping in this stepped-up war, but he kept open house for visiting ship captains, and was, or gave the appearance of being, very available to officers who needed his counsel. Actually, Sock McMorris protected Nimitz from much of the detail these days, and his quick yeses and quicker nos were famous in the fleet. Forrest Sherman spent much time thinking and talking over problems with Nimitz, and as usual the senior staff met every day to keep a running contact with the war. The public at large scarcely knew Nimitz, in spite of the occasional article that had appeared in one of the big magazines. The war in the Pacific, to this point, was MacArthur's war, and, when the Navy was mentioned at all, Halsey's war. Nimitz was happy to have it that way, knowing that his place in the Navy did not depend on public acclaim, and apparently he was also oblivious to his place in history. He kept some memorabilia and a file of correspondence, particularly his admiral-to-admiral correspondence, which was personal but official. The command had its war diary, which described the various daily happenings of note, and the more confidential Grey Book, which included estimates of situations and some comments on personnel, as prepared by the senior members of the staff with Nimitz's approval. Both, of course, were secret at the time. Overall, however, Nimitz was even more shy than Spruance in matters of personal publicity. In January of this year, when the list of 5-star officers was published, and Nimitz was among them, his name suddenly leaped out to the American public for almost the first time. Admiral William V. Pratt, one of the oldest and wisest heads in the Navy, who had retired and was writing a weekly column on the war for Newsweek, suggested that it was time Nimitz had a little publicity. "Now I want to tell you something, and it is not hot air," Pratt wrote Nimitz. "I have watched your work, and in my opinion you have displayed all the qualities a top leader should possess. It is about time a few bouquets were given to the Navy for the magnificent work it has done in the Pacific, and I am going to do it." Pratt did write a column on Nimitz, but Nimitz scarcely appreciated the honour. At about this time, Navy Public Relations in Washington suggested to Captain Miller at Fleet Headquarters that Nimitz ought to be built up personally in view of the pressure from public and Congress that was pointing to MacArthur as the man to lead the invasion of Japan. "Any plan for a publicity build-up for me is absolutely contrary to my ideas for the conduct of the war in the Pacific and meets with my disapproval," Nimitz said, "as well as the disapproval of Mr. Forrestal, with whom I have discussed this in the last 2 days." Forrestal was in the Pacific in February, when the letter was written, for he had determined that he was going to be in on one of these amphibious landings, and he had chosen the Iwo Jima operation. The usual build-up by Kelly Turner had begun months earlier, while Spruance sat in Pearl Harbor and made his plans for the big step forward. Holland Smith looked over the intelligence reports and the statistics and said Iwo Jima would be the toughest fight his Marines had yet taken on. He would take the island, he said, but his casualties would be high and the fighting would be very fierce. This warning gave Spruance pause, because he was the principal architect of the Iwo Jima plan. In the floundering that accompanied the basic disagreement between MacArthur, who wanted Philippines-Japan, and the Navy, which wanted Central Pacific China, King had grasped at Spruance's proposals for Iwo Jima and Okinawa as stepping stones to Asia proper. Now, worried, Spruance began rechecking all the facts that had led to his proposal. What comforted him most was the assurance by Major General Curtis LeMay of the Quickswan Bombing Command that Iwo Jima would be invaluable to him for his B-29 operations against the Japanese homeland. Because of the difficulties, the Japanese were heavily dug in. Holland Smith wanted a 10-day bombardment of Iwo Jima. Spruance said it was impossible, there was no time for it. 3 days was all he could grant. After all, as they all agreed, Iwo had been bombed intermittently for the last 8 months, and as of the day of invasion would have been bombed daily for 72 days. That should be enough shock and destruction. It was just a year before the Americans had begun stepping up the pace and taken the Marshalls. With that loss and the breach of the Empire's line, the Japanese had begun fortification of the inner line, of which Iwo was a part. For a solid year the Japanese had been rebuilding their fortifications of Iwo Jima. Its strength to resist would be very great, and everyone knew it. The strength of the American Navy had also grown very great in the past year too. The Navy had 23 battleships, 89 carriers, 13 of the 27 000-ton carriers, 3 pre-1942 carriers, 8 light carriers and 65 escort carriers, 62 cruisers, 371 destroyers, 378 destroyer escorts, 238 submarines, 1,161 fighting ships in all. By the end of 1945 it was projected that the Navy would have 1,337 more ships, including 30 more cruisers, and as much of this power as was needed could be turned against Japan. Besides this, the keels were laid in 1944 for 345 000-ton supercarriers. The difference between 1944 and 1945 was shown very clearly in the Lingayen Gulf landings on Luzon by General MacArthur's forces. This landing was conducted entirely by Admiral Kinkaid and his 7th Fleet. He had battleships and cruisers aplenty, mostly from Sinkspack on loan, 15 escort carriers, 6 seaplane tenders, and hundreds of planes in support from airfields to the south. It was true that the going was getting tougher all the time, because of the numbers of Japanese troops, and the kamikazes who threatened every ship afloat, and the growing determination of the Japanese to resist. But the numbers of American troops, planes, guns, and ships were increasing every week. It would have to be thus, and so would General MacArthur's force have to increase, for there were nearly 200,000 Japanese troops on Luzon. The war was taking a very different course now that the Americans were nearing Japan. Nimitz's relationship to the Philippines operation was simply to be in support, which meant that he supplied the ships and some of the commanders, and the means to sustain them in the battle. He had no say about operations, nor any time to worry about them. In mid-January, when the invasion of Luzon began, Nimitz's concerns were Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and what lay beyond. Neither Nimitz nor Spruance had any taste for invading Japan, but they could see the pressure building up day after day. Iwo Jima was to be taken by the old team, so to speak. Spruance was in charge. Kelly Turner was commander of the Expeditionary Force. Holland Smith was commander of the Expeditionary Troops, and under him came the V Amphibious Corps, with Major General Harry Schmidt in command. Rear Admiral Harry Hill had the attack force, and Rear Admiral W.H.P. Blandy was the support force commander. Mark Mitcher would bring in Task Force 58. Additions representing the growing power were a logistic support group and a search and reconnaissance group. The Japanese build-up of Iwo Jima brought the force to 21,000 defenders, but that figure scarcely told the story. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent many months rebuilding the defences, and as the Americans flew over the island taking photographs, Kelly Turner's photo interpreters said they could see the positions being strengthened day by day. The shore guns, for example, were placed in position to have protection from naval gunfire, with 4 to 6 feet of concrete around them. Anti-aircraft guns were placed in fortified pits so that it would take a direct hit to knock one out. The island was tunnelled until it became a beehive of caves and passageways under the surface. General Kuribayashi did what he intended to do, transform the island into a fortress. The Americans knew it would be tough going, yet they did not know how tough. Spruance's plan called for a strong carrier strike on the Tokyo area just before the landings. The purpose was to take Japanese attention away from a bombardment of Iwo Jima that would begin 3 days before the landings. Furthermore, the air attack would keep Japanese planes from coming to Iwo until the Marines had a chance to establish themselves there. Holland Smith and his generals really put up a stiff fight to get more bombardment time, but the best they could achieve was Spruance's agreement to give Admiral Blandy the option to bombard for 1 extra day if he felt it would help. The Spruance-Turner argument against longer bombardment was that it would not be possible because of the limited availability of ships, ammunition and supplies, and the surprise angle. The ships and ammunition were a real problem. Nimitz was shuttling supply ships and others from 7th Fleet for 5th Fleet, so as to support these heavy military undertakings in both quarters. On January 27th, Admiral Halsey turned over command of the fast battleships, the fast carriers, and their supporting ships to Admiral Spruance, and the organisation once again became 5th Fleet. Spruance spent his days planning the next operation, to Okinawa, and making sure of the readiness of various units for the Iwo Jima fight. He was particularly concerned with the coming carrier strike on the Tokyo area, because it was apparent in the battle for the Philippines that the Japanese were still able to turn out airplanes very quickly and very well. I could see no object in any longer fighting these aircraft around the perimeter if we could by accurate bombing wreck the factories where they were being produced and so reduce the output. Aircraft factories were strategic targets, and as such they found a new important place in Spruance's mind, and his thinking about the carrier expanded. On February 8th, Spruance sailed, and on February 16th, Task Force 58, the fast carriers hit Japan from a point only 60 miles off the coast of Honshu. The strike was vigorous, but not very successful as far as the aircraft factories were concerned. The force claimed 341 Japanese planes shot down and 190 destroyed on the ground, with losses of 88 planes from all causes. The tactical value of the strike was to delay Japanese air assistance to Iwo Jima. Holland Smith continued to believe it would have been more effective warfare to give longer fire support in the way of pre-invasion bombardment. Again, it was the problem of an officer's particular view of the war. One reason Spruance was apparently so stubborn in resisting the demands for longer bombardment was the timing of the whole Central Pacific campaign. Originally, it had been hoped that Iwo Jima would be invaded on January 20th, but logistic problems affecting MacArthur and Nimitz had caused a delay until February 19th, and Spruance did not see how he could delay any longer. for after Iwo Jima there must be an interlude, and then the Okinawa operation, and Spruance had to backtime, schedule backwards, from the beginning of the hurricane or typhoon season. He also had to share his ships with MacArthur. Obviously, he could not let the Okinawa invasion be caught in a typhoon. Halsey's typhoon had shown just what could happen, and if that damage were multiplied by cargo ships and landing vessels that were not so very seaworthy, there could be the devil to pay. The Iwo Jima operation had been months in the planning, and shiploading had begun in December. In the last few weeks, the worried Marines had asked for many aerial photographs. In studying them, General Schmidt and Admiral Hill and his staff discovered something they had not known, something that brought frowns to their faces. Looking at a Japanese LCI, landing craft infantry, that had been wrecked on the beach, they could see the working of the beach stuff around the vessel, which indicated an extremely soft beach. Later they were to discover that the beach was nothing but dark volcanic sand and cinders, which seemed to have no packing quality at all. Hill ordered up some Marston netting and had it made into pieces 10 feet by 1.5 feet. Hinged, it could be put together in an accordion pleat and stretched out to 50-foot lengths. These would be spread out for tractors, and by pulling them along they could quickly set up a 150-foot length. They tried it on an Oahu beach, and it worked very nicely. There were new devices in this operation, as each landing taught the amphibious commanders more about their strange business. They had cranes and fire pups for the beaches, and 7 armoured bulldozers. On January 11th, Hill and General Schmidt left Pearl Harbor in the Auburn, Hill's flagship. At that moment, Admiral Hill was not certain that he was not going to be commander of this force. Turner was laid up with a bad back and actually had given command to Hill. But on January 27th, Turner overcame his personal miseries, struggled into a back brace, and took command. They sailed, Turner with the 5th Division in the lead, and Hill 25 miles astern with the 4th Marine Division in his ships. On February 5th, they were in Eniwetok to take on last-minute supplies. On February 11th, they were in Saipan, and there Secretary Forrestal joined Turner and General Holland Smith on the flagship El Dorado. Turner was sick again, and almost from day to day Hill did not know whether he was to command or be second in command. 3 days before the invasion, Admiral Blandy began his bombardment. The weather was not very good, and Blandy did not use up all the ammunition scheduled, nor did he opt to take the 4th day for bombardment. Later, Holland Smith was to say this decision caused many more American casualties than were necessary. Admiral Hill, however, thought quite differently about it. Based upon my knowledge of the called gunfire over Admiral Turner's circuits, which were monitored during the following days by my staff, it is my firm opinion that most of the targets suitable for destruction by naval gunfire had been eliminated. One such was a group of targets masked by the Japanese, very successfully, during the opening hours of the invasion. General Kuribayashi, who would have been an ornament to any nation's army, had ordered his defenders to remain concealed until the troops began to move ashore, then open up. But on D2, when the underwater demolition teams, UDT, were moving into the beaches of Iwo Jima to check for obstructions and clear the way, the Japanese defenders mistook the UDT men for the invasion force and began firing guns and mortars from the hills. All 12 of the LCIs involved were hit, which gives a good indication of the guns and the marksmanship. But the guns were exposed, and many of them were silenced in the next 2 days. The landings went off as scheduled, except that the cinders were far worse than expected, and the vehicles immediately began bogging down. Infantrymen sank in up to their ankles and could only shuffle along. It was going to be a tough fight, that much was obvious. Tough it was. The Japanese were so well dug in, and their guns so well placed, that they had to be routed out, position by position, with flamethrowers, artillery, and grenades. It was the old game of sealing the caves shut once again. On D+1, the southern airfield was taken. On D+2, the 5th Fleet met the kamikazes, mixed in with regular fighters and bombers for the first time. Saratoga was hit, the Bismarck Sea was sunk, and Lunga Point was damaged. Turner, with the Secretary of the Navy aboard, retired from the area for a time. The fighting was very fierce, but on February 23rd, Mount Suribachi was taken, and photographer Joe Rosenthal's famous flag-raising picture was made. On D+13, the first B-29 made an emergency landing on the Numpel 1 airfield, illustrating the value of Iwo Jima to the war effort. By that time, the big fleet carriers had gone back to Ulithi to get ready for the Okinawa operation. On March 5th, Admiral Spruance decided the critical period on Iwo Jima was over, and he sailed for Ulithi to take up his planning again. On March 8th, Turner turned command over to Hill and followed Spruance. Holland Smith moved from the El Dorado to Hill's Auburn. Holland Smith, by this time, was a nervous wreck. Whatever else had happened, his relief of Ralph Smith at Saipan had ruined Holland Smith's future in the Pacific War. In title, he was in command of the expeditionary troops. In fact, he was kept on shipboard all during this operation, only allowed ashore by Turner for inspections, and not allowed to direct his Marines. He spent most of his time in his cabin. After he came over to Auburn, Hill, who liked Smith and felt sorry for him, would go down to the general's cabin to play cribbage. It was one of Smith's few reliefs from the loneliness in which he now found himself. For Smith had become a victim of the inter-service power struggle. Admiral Hill conceived of a diversionary operation of his own. He sent the destroyers Dorsch and Cotton on a sweep to sink 2 trawler-type pickets off Japan, and let it be indicated by radio messages that the battle force was out. He called it Operation Sockham. When Nimitz heard of it, he approved, and so did King, but King also felt constrained to tap Hill on the wrist for using a code name that forecast the type of operation conducted. On March 23rd, Nimitz visited Iwo Jima. He had just come back to the Pacific after a trip to Washington, where he had lunched with President Roosevelt and met with Admiral King to discuss high strategy again. At these meetings, Admiral Cook, King's planner, suggested that after the Okinawa operation, the Pacific forces should go into Chushan and the Kurils. But Nimitz's basic planning was still awaiting the outcome of the Philippine and Okinawa operations. Iwo Jima fighting lasted until March 26th. It was as expensive as Holland Smith and General Schmidt had feared it would be. 6,000 Marines and 900 Navy men were killed, and 19,000 were wounded in wiping out all but 216 of the 21,000 Japanese fighters on the island. Smith, thoroughly embittered against Navy and Army, soon went home to a training command, never again to return to the Pacific. In the forthcoming operation against Okinawa, a British task force would work with the Americans. Vice Admiral Sir Bernard Rawlings was bringing 4 carriers, 2 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 11 destroyers to participate in the Pacific War. The manner of their use had occasioned many conferences at Pearl Harbor and Guam, but in the end they were assigned as a Special Task Force 57 and given the job of covering the airfields of Sakishima Gunto, the group of islands that lay midway between Okinawa and Formosa, and from which many Japanese aircraft could normally expect to stage to defend Okinawa. Because of this cooperation, months later, Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, Commander-in-Chief of the British Pacific Fleet, came out to Guam to present Nimitz with a new honour, British knighthood in the ancient and honourable Order of the Bath. Originally, the Duke of Gloucester had been chosen to do the honours, but he was busy in Australia at the moment, and so Sir Bruce had the task. At 1100 one morning, Nimitz and several members of his staff went aboard Sir Bruce's flagship for the ceremony, and after reading from an impressive document, the British Admiral placed the broad scarlet ribbon of the order about his opposite number's neck. Then grog was issued to the crew and the cheers went up. The British had an old naval custom for visiting firemen, as Sir Bruce informed Commander Lamar, the Admiral's aide. "Flags," said Sir Bruce. "It is the custom that when your master splices the main brace, issues free grog to the crew in honour of some important occasion, you down a tot of grog bottoms up." Commander Lamar was not much of a drinker, nor was he used to drinking black British rum in the heat of the day, 125 at noon in the sun. But he manfully downed his tot, then headed below deck to the first officer's cabin and the head, where he retched up the rum, took a shower, sobered up, and recomposed himself. He came back on deck to find that no one had noticed his absence, and to pull one of the social gaffes of the war. There was another old British custom, which held that if the midshipmen of any ship were able to cozen a flag officer to come into their mess, they were entitled to free drinks at the expense of the commanding officer of their ship for the rest of the week. Commander Lamar did not know of this custom, of course, although all his British counterparts did, and no British admiral would go to a midshipman's mess unless there was some very heroic reason for it. But the young rascals suspected American ignorance, so they innocently came to Lamar and asked if Nimitz would come to their mess. Lamar knew that Nimitz liked to make a show of being friendly to young officers when he could, so grandly Lamar accepted for his commander. And thus Admiral Fraser and the captain of his flagship were stuck for a week, while the young midshipmen drank up everything in sight at their expense. January 1st, August 13th, 1945. Life at Guam was always more exciting than life at Pearl Harbor had been. One night, the Marine Guards were aroused by a Japanese soldier coming up the cliff. They rushed to the Nimitz house, woke up Lieutenant Commander Lamar, and then rushed back to the edge of the cliff to begin blazing away with their rifles. Lamar awakened Nimitz, who came out with his .45 automatic and joined the shooting. In the morning, all that could be found was a worn knapsack, a few fish hooks, and a blood-stained rifle. Each day Nimitz would hold his meetings and then go for a swim at his beach, taking along any visitor and a handful of members of his staff. The swims took the place of some of the long walks, and the Admiral dispensed with lunch these days, in deference to his expanding waistline. By the time Spruance and the Central Pacific forces began the invasion of Okinawa, the Nimitz life was subtly different from any time in the recent past. He was writing Halsey about fleet public relations and explaining the efforts that were being made, such as setting up a special press transmission ship, the Mount McKinley. He was corresponding with all his admirals about the post-war fleet. To be sure, Japan was still in the war, and there was a long way to go to defeat her, yet the odour of victory was definitely in the air already. Spruance had issued his operations plan for the Okinawa invasion on January 3rd. Okinawa would represent the end of the planning for the moment. From there it would be about equal in mileage to move to China or Japan. Okinawa would be a new kind of operation for Spruance and Nimitz, for although Spruance was to be in charge, with Mitcher running the fast carriers and Turner running the amphibious operation, the army would be the force to land and take the island. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner would bring the 10th Army into the invasion. Yes, an army, for Okinawa, the island that was central to the campaign, was a landmass of nearly 500 square miles. The struggle between Army and Navy ways became a little more intense. Nimitz wanted some land-based air support, but Admiral Hoover's planes were too far away to be of any use, and the only planes other than carrier planes that could soften up Okinawa were the B-29 superfortresses. General LeMay had very definite ideas about the uses of his superfortresses, and they did not include tactical support of amphibious operations. LeMay and Nimitz argued the point for some time, and according to LeMay's public relations officer, St. Clair McElway, the irascible LeMay even suggested that Nimitz was impairing the war effort by demanding the B-29S over Okinawa when they preferred to be over Japan. Perhaps Holland Smith's vigorous complaints about the naval bombardment at Iwo Jima bore some fruit, for Admiral Blandy was to give 8 days' bombardment at Okinawa. It was planned that General Buckner would have Major General Geiger and the 1st, 2nd, and 6th Marine Divisions, 4 infantry divisions of the Army Thwaitor Corps, under Major General John R. Hodge, with a 5th Division in reserve. It meant there would be more than 170,000 American combat troops on Okinawa to challenge an estimated 77,000 Japanese. To land these troops, it would take 8 transport squadrons of 57 ships each. First of all, Admiral Mitcher's Task Force 58 began softening up the island. Jocko Clark was back in action, along with Ralph Davison, Ted Sherman, and Arthur Radford, each in command of a task group. It was expected that the Japanese would meet the American force with some 2,000 or 3,000 planes over Okinawa. From the moment the task force went into action on March 18th, the kamikazes, one-way missions, began coming in, and they proved to be more troublesome at Okinawa than they had ever been before. Radford's Enterprise was hit by a bomb, Intrepid was damaged by a near miss, and Yorktown was bombed successfully by a non-kamikaze bomber. One bomb blew 2 big holes in her. Next day, Admiral Davison's Wasp was bombed so successfully that fires broke out on 5 decks, and 101 men were killed and 269 wounded. The damage seemed almost as severe as that to old Lexington at Coral Sea, but such were the improvements in the new carriers in terms of firefighting and damage control that Wasp continued to operate for several days. Davison's flagship, the Franklin, was even worse hit. One bomb wrecked the forward elevator and started many fires on the hangar deck. A second bomb hit the flight deck, set fire to planes that were ready to launch, and bathed the ship in flame. Admiral Davison and Admiral Bogan, who was riding as an observer, left the ship to transfer to the Hancock, and Davidson told Captain Leslie Gares to abandon ship. Gares sent all but his essential officers and men over the side. Franklin went dead in the water, but Gares and his men saved the ship and eventually took her back to the United States under her own power. Those 2 bombs caused the deaths of 725 men and the wounding of 265 more. That was the way it went at Okinawa. As the Americans moved into the Ryukyus, of which Okinawa is the largest island, the Japanese defences stiffened even more than in the past. The Japanese brought out special suicide gliders called Baka bombs. They manned suicide boats filled with explosives. On March 25th, the bombardment of Okinawa began, and so did the kamikaze attacks. From this point on, they would be regular, day by day, coming in groups of 1 to 20, or in huge waves. Spruance was on hand in the Indianapolis for the bombardment, and on March 31st, D1, his flagship was hit by a kamikaze. 4 attacked, 3 were shot down, and 1 crashed into the ship's port quarter. 9 men were killed and 20 wounded, but Spruance was untouched. The landings at Okinawa were fairly easy. General Ushijima, the Japanese commander, had decided to make his stand in the hills around Naha and on the Motobu Peninsula, rather than concentrate his strength to oppose the landings. Spruance was not there. Indianapolis had gone to the base at Kerama-Retto for repairs. Later, Spruance transferred to the New Mexico, and Indianapolis went back to the United States for overhaul. The suicide planes demanded new techniques to counter the threat, and Kelly Turner developed them. 16 radar picket ships were established around Okinawa to intercept and report on incoming enemy flights. These were strengthened by 2 ships as the pickets began to take a beating from the kamikazes. What the Japanese called Operation Tengo began on April 6th with a raid of 355 kamikazes. They got 3 destroyers, 2 ammunition ships, and an LST. They damaged 9 destroyers and escorts, a mine layer, and a dozen other ships. Altogether, before Okinawa was taken, the kamikazes sank 26 ships and damaged 200, including 6 carriers. Involved in these raids were regular planes and 1,900 kamikazes, 250 of them coming from Formosa and the rest from Japan. Roughly, 1 in 10 of these planes got through the American fire. On April 6th and 7, Spruance and Mitcher found and tracked the Japanese super battleship Yamato, which had come out with a light cruiser and 8 destroyers. Spruance was in a position to decide how to destroy Yamato at this point in the war. Should it be by the fast carriers, which could certainly do the job, or should he let the old battleships have a little fun? Rear Admiral Morton L. Deo had these battleships, 6 of them, with 7 cruisers and 21 destroyers as a fire support force. Spruance decided too to go along in his flagship, but on April 7th it appeared that the Yamato was not coming direct and might get away. Mitcher asked Spruance, "Will you take them or shall I?" And Spruance gave up the chance for the gun duel. "You take them," he said. Mitcher took them. In an hour and a half, the planes of his fast carrier force put 9 torpedoes and 51,000 pounds bombs into Yamato. She capsized, blew up, and sank. The carrier planes also sank the light cruiser and 4 of the 8 destroyers, damaging all 4 of the others. By this time, no more proof of the vast power of the fast carrier forces was needed. What was happening now, as far as Japanese naval vessels were concerned, was that they had become tidbits for the fast carriers to digest amid the more prosaic but essential tasks of hitting the Japanese at home and protecting the fleet from the dying gasps of Japanese land-based air defence. Spruance continued in command of what had become a drawn-out and wearing operation. He brought battle repair ships to the area. He worked out new dispositions and ship movements. Spruance grew impatient with the Army's method of advance. On May 13th, he wrote to his old Chief of Staff, Captain Moore. The Japanese casualties reported by the 10th Army are pure estimates, not actual counts of dead Japanese. I don't take these estimates much more seriously than I do the Japanese figures on our casualties. Since the push started on the 19th of April, we have advanced about 4,000 yards. There are times when I get impatient for some of Holland Smith's drive, but there is nothing we can do about it. Iwo was a very tough job for the Marines, but they finished it up in 26 days. I doubt if the Army's slow, methodical method of fighting really saves any lives in the long run. It merely spreads the casualties over a longer period. The longer period greatly increases the Navy casualties when Japanese air attack on ships is a continuing factor. However, I do not believe the Army is at all allergic to losses of naval ships and personnel. May 12th Spruance had a narrow escape. New Mexico had gone to Caramaretto to take on ammunition, and left late in the afternoon to return to Okinawa and anchor for the night. Spruance described the event to Moore. Just about sundown, 2 low-flying bogies came in through our radar pickets from the westward, presumably from Formosa. A few minutes before we anchored, they arrived on the scene, picked out the New Mexico, his flagship, and dived on her. One was shot down, landing in the water close aboard on our port quarter. A few moments later, the other landed on us, coming in on the starboard side, just about the foremast structure. The bomb went off on the superstructure deck just about the foremast, while the plane crashed in the uptake space on the forward side of the stack. The most curious part of the whole business was that ammunition from the anti-aircraft battery was knocked down into the hole made by the plane, and fell through the battle bars into several of the boilers, where it went off, putting 3 of our 4 boilers out of commission, probably for several days. The casualties were about 50 killed, mostly in the anti-aircraft batteries, but some on the quarterdeck, either from strafing or from fire from other ships. About 80 men seriously wounded, and a good many more with minor injuries. Except for several of Slonim's men, Slonim was the Japanese language expert, who were close to the bomb explosion, the staff had no casualties. Slonim had just left there to come aft to tell me the Japanese planes were close. Otherwise he would have been killed. Burns, the meteorological officer, was knocked down on our signal bridge, but not hurt. I had just started for the bridge when the AA batteries opened up, so I remained under cover while going forward on the second deck, and we were hit before I got very far, which was fortunate for me, as the 2 routes to the bridge led right through the area where the plane and bomb hit. This is my second experience with a suicide plane making a hit on board my own ship, and I have seen 4 other ships hit near me. The suicide plane is a very effective weapon which we must not underestimate. I don't believe anyone who had not been around within this area of operation can realize its potentialities against ships. It is the opposite extreme from a lot of our Army heavy bombers, who bomb safely and ineffectively from the upper atmosphere. Spruance grew very restless, as his letter indicated. He liked to go ashore, but General Buckner did not like it at all. Okinawa was hardly safe, and Buckner could not guarantee Spruance's safety. Spruance was delighted then to be relieved late in May by Admiral Halsey, who had taken home leave and then spent the last 6 weeks in Pearl Harbor planning. One plan called for the invasion of the China coast 100 miles south of Shanghai. The other, which appealed to Halsey, was an assault on Kyushu. Nimitz made several changes all at the same time. Spruance was recalled. Turner, promoted to full admiral, was brought back with Spruance, and Harry Hill, promoted to vice admiral, was sent to supervise the remainder of the Okinawa operation, along with Admiral McCain, who relieved Mitchell as commander of the fast carriers. It might appear that the Okinawa operation was over, but such was hardly the case. It had seemed easy. The Marines had done so well in the beginning that Kelly Turner had returned the 2nd Marine Division, which was in reserve, and it had gone to Guam in April. But the Japanese were very tough, and in June Hill had to bring them back. Spruance had already suggested to Nimitz that the target date for the landing on the Chinese coast be August 15th, which meant there was little time if that was to be carried out. He had never liked the idea of a Japan landing. The question of what operations should be undertaken after Okinawa, Spruance said, whether to the coast of China or to the main islands of Japan, was a most important one. It was my opinion at the time, and I have never had any reason to change it, that landings in Japan proper, such as the planned Kyushu on the 1st of November 1945, were not necessary and would have been extremely costly. Nimitz, all this while, was having serious difficulties of his own at Guam. It seemed that General MacArthur was trying to move in on him. On April 13th, Lieutenant General Sutherland and General Kenny arrived at Guam to discuss future command relationships. Sutherland began that evening to lay out MacArthur's ideas. As soon as possible, Sutherland said, MacArthur intended to take command of all army forces in the Pacific, including the garrisons of the islands under Nimitz. All previous command arrangements had been unsatisfactory to the army, Sutherland said, and the principle of unity of command was an unworkable shibboleth. Warming to his idea, Sutherland said further that in the future no army troops were going to serve under any admiral. Sutherland had apparently been deluded by Nimitz's mild manners into believing that the admiral would take such dicta lying down. He was quickly disabused of the notion. He was informed, Nimitz told King in a radio message, that unity of command in the Pacific Ocean areas had gotten us through our period of adversity and moved us to the inner approaches of Japan, and was the only feasible arrangement for operating and defending an area and coordinating area matters. Nimitz said he would relinquish the control of troops to MacArthur as they came out of operations. However, the essential garrison of all positions in the Pacific Ocean areas must remain under my operational control as long as I am responsible for those areas. Abolition of unity of command in the Suburias and outlying islands would produce chaos and would retard the prosecution of the war. I shall not, therefore, accede to his assuming operational control of army forces, ground, air, or service, which are essential to the defence and functions of the Pacific Ocean areas. Nimitz informed King that MacArthur was planning to take over the Ryukyus too, and to mount an assault on Kyushu in November. The next day the conferences continued. Sutherland and Kenny made detailed proposals to take over the Ryukyus operation, which included Okinawa. MacArthur had told them to do so because the Ryukyus were his paramount interest as the axis of his advance into Japan. Kenny wanted to move the 5th Air Force into Okinawa, to which Nimitz saw no objection at all, except that of overall command. They discussed Operation Olympic, which was to be the invasion of Japan. They agreed that MacArthur would draft a plan and send it to Nimitz, who would redraft and revise as he saw fit, and they would meet in Manila for another planning conference. Nimitz informed King that the one difficulty was the matter of command relationships, and, of course, unless he was prepared to take the back seat, this difficulty would continue. An interesting sidelight, Nimitz added, is that Sutherland says MacArthur will land in Kyushu about D+3, stay a short time, and then return to Manila until time for the Honshu landing. Later that day, Nimitz quite lost his patience with the MacArthur representatives when they delivered a paper making the same proposals that had been turned down the day before, adding that Nimitz should take over operational control of naval operations in the Southwest Pacific. The idea was very clearly to push Nimitz into accepting MacArthur as his boss. Since these ideas were consuming valuable time and delaying constructive planning, Nimitz told King, I authorized McMorris to inform Sutherland in writing as follows. Then Nimitz detailed what he would do and would not do. First, he said it was important to arrange method, time, and place for coordination of the invasion planning and preparations ordered by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was a veiled reminder to MacArthur that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were in control. Such coordination was necessary, Nimitz said, so that he could plan the naval and amphibious operations. Once, and hopefully for all, he stipulated what he would and would not do. He would not transfer shore positions to MacArthur. He would not relinquish control of army forces. He would control all these forces unless the Joint Chiefs ordered him to do otherwise. He would also control logistics in his area unless ordered otherwise. He would not take over MacArthur's naval forces. He would provide naval cover and would provide naval forces to operate under MacArthur. There was more talk. To give them a carrot as well as the stick, Nimitz finally agreed that he might reconsider giving MacArthur operational control of shore positions after Okinawa was taken, or when a firm directive is received for the Olympic operation. But as it developed, the MacArthur representatives were in no position to talk about anything except MacArthur's demands, which had been rejected. It now appears that the SWPA party will leave at 160800, April 16, 8 a.m. Very little useful discussion has taken place concerning invasion plans and preparations, and the SWPA party was apparently not prepared for such discussion, Nimitz said wryly to King. MacArthur was completely unyielding in the matter of control and command. He would not come to Guam to confer with Nimitz. For a time, Nimitz attempted to solve their mutual problems by sending emissaries, usually Forrest Sherman, to Manila to talk with MacArthur's staff. MacArthur's sense of protocol was such that Sherman was able to accomplish relatively little. In May, Nimitz again went to see MacArthur in the interest of solving their problems. The problems revolved around the concept of the war, but it was becoming apparent that MacArthur was winning the struggle. With the defeat of Germany, General Marshall and the chiefs of the Army and the Air Force suddenly realized that the Pacific was very heavily a Navy show. The way to make it an Army show was to create the need for employment of huge numbers of troops and military equipment. This meant, and could only mean, the invasion of Japan itself. The Navy's concept of moving into the Chinese coast had always depended on the establishment of bases and the maintenance of naval and air support by the Americans, but the use of Chinese manpower on the continent. These were points that Nimitz had made time and again in the conferences with King. By the time of the Okinawa invasion, the complexion of the war against Japan had changed. The British definitely had come into the war, and Spruance had very successfully used his British Task Force 57 in the campaign. Upon Marshall's insistence, said Admiral King, which also reflected MacArthur's views, the Joint Chiefs had prepared plans for landings in Kyushu and eventually in the Tokyo Plain. King and Leahy did not like the idea, but as unanimous decisions were necessary in the Joint Chiefs meetings, they reluctantly acquiesced, feeling that in the end sea power would accomplish the defeat of Japan, as proved to be the case. The decision had been that MacArthur would be in charge of the ground forces in the campaign, while Nimitz would assist MacArthur in establishing a large beachhead from which the army troops could operate, as well as helping with naval gunfire, naval aviation, logistic support, and anti-submarine operations. With Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12th, the situation became even more murky, but by May it was fairly well indicated that the MacArthur approach was going to be hard to overcome. The difficulties were readily apparent in the past operations in the Philippines, where Halsey had complained about the MacArthur policy of maintaining Army, Air Force, and Navy commands as separate and equal under his overall leadership. The Navy theory was precisely opposite, but political and international considerations now became far more important than before. Congressmen began coming out to the Pacific for tours, as Senator Tidings of Maryland did with a party at the end of May. Special representatives of the State Department showed up for duty at Guam, because diplomatic considerations were arising. Even the Reconstruction Finance Corporation now became involved in the Pacific, in the islands taken from the Japanese. Early in June, as Halsey was getting ready to make more airstrikes in support of the Okinawa operations, he ran into another storm. The storm was off to the southwest of the fleet, and on the afternoon of June 4th, Admiral Halsey set a course away from the storm for his fleet, while some of the ships began fueling. On the evening of June 4th, reports began to come in from Guam about the storm centres to the west and southwest. They were moving east, but Halsey's advisers convinced him to move to the northwest, and they did so right into the track of the storm, which was the recurving of the typhoon. Admiral Clark suggested that they head away, and so did Admiral Hill, but Halsey refused, guided by his own aerographer. The result, again, was heavy damage to the ships. In Clark's task group, the Hornet and Bennington both suffered partial flight deck collapse when steel girders broke. The heavy cruiser Pittsburgh lost her bow. Belleau Wood lost a man overboard. Altogether, 33 ships were damaged, 142 planes were destroyed, and 6 men were lost. Again there was a court of inquiry, and again Admiral Hoover presided. Again he was inclined to recommend the court-martial of Admiral Halsey for carelessness in this disaster. Admiral Lockwood was a member of the court, and he summed up the problem pithily. The whole matter certainly is a mess, and indicates that nobody ever heard of a guy named Bowditch. The recommendation of the court was very strong against Halsey, McCain, and Jocko Clark, whose force had been hard hit. It went to the Secretary of the Navy, and for a time there was talk of retiring Halsey. But one did not court-martial or retire America's favourite and most famous fighting admiral, particularly if one was Secretary of the Navy with a very strong bent for public relations. Nimitz, however, was thoroughly annoyed with Halsey, and their correspondence from that point on took on a definitely cooler tone. Actually, the coolness had begun with the first typhoon, for Nimitz had also considered that to be a totally unnecessary disaster. Admiral Clark had been criticised for not moving independently quickly enough, in view of the directive from Nimitz after the first typhoon, which instructed commanders to inform Nimitz directly when they were in weather trouble. But Clark took the position that as a rear admiral he could scarcely go over the heads of McCain and Halsey, and it seemed a reasonable position. An indication of Nimitz's loss of confidence in Halsey came in his direct correspondence with Admiral Hill on matters concerning the naval forces around Okinawa that summer. Halsey objected to Nimitz's dealing directly with Hill. "I would feel a great deal better if my own recommendations were sought rather than one of my subordinates," he told Nimitz. "I will be much better able to execute your orders, directives, and policies if you can see your way clear to working through me." There were other complaints. The carrier task group commanders found Halsey extremely difficult to work for. The fact was that carrier warfare had become so improved and so complicated when Halsey was managing the South Pacific campaign from Noumea that he had gotten out of touch with the techniques as they developed. Instead of starting out afresh, finding himself a new staff of men who had matured rapidly in these 2 years of modern carrier warfare, Halsey had stubbornly, loyally stuck with his old staff. The result, as some carrier task group commanders indicated, was very often near chaos. "When Admiral Spruance was in command," said Admiral Arthur Radford, "you knew precisely what he was going to do. The orders were written clearly and delivered promptly, and except for tactical changes, they stood as written. But when Admiral Halsey was in command, you never knew what he was going to do. Every night the changes would come in the night orders, and often, as the commanders complained, the changes were so complicated and referred to so many different messages that the staffs of the task groups spent hours puzzling over the message board, hoping they knew at the end what Halsey intended to do and what action they were supposed to take. And as Nimitz cooled down, the relationship bettered that summer, although it would never again be as close as during those days of desperation in the South Pacific when Halsey was truly carrying the war. In mid-June, the Third Fleet was relieved of its responsibility to cover the Okinawa struggle, and Halsey went to Manila, where Japanese resistance was just being ended. He found MacArthur jubilant and cheerful, understandably. It was becoming an army war, as far as he was concerned. By July 1st, Admiral Hill's amphibious force was no longer needed at Okinawa, and it was dissolved. Admiral Oldendorf was promoted to Vice Admiral and given a new striking force of cruisers and destroyers to ravage Japanese shipping in the home waters. This task was already being performed handsomely by Admiral Lockwood's submarines, and early in July Halsey was again turned loose, this time to go into Japanese waters and hit Japan itself. His task force, still under McCain, consisted of 3 groups under Rear Admirals T.L. Sprague, G.F. Bogan and Arthur Radford. Admiral Jocko Clark had been relieved, and he was certainly entitled to a rest after many months of command in the Pacific. His attorney at the Court of Inquiry had subjected Admiral Halsey to very severe questioning too, and it took no genius to realize Clark's future relationship with Halsey and McCain could scarcely be very cordial, although in his writing and public statements Halsey never said a word of criticism of his junior. Halsey struck the Japanese islands repeatedly, against very little opposition, and Admiral Shafroth struck with a bombardment force of battleships and cruisers. From now until the end of the war, the Americans prowled the Japanese waters almost at will, exercising their overwhelming naval and air force. Meanwhile, Nimitz and MacArthur were trying to sort out the elements of command. Perhaps the most helpful person in this series of discussions was Admiral Kinkaid, who had the respect and liking of both men. Nimitz had been disturbed by Sutherland's statements that MacArthur would not permit a single soldier to be commanded by Admiral Turner or any other admiral. How could the Navy carry out its amphibious responsibilities? Kinkaid took the matter up with MacArthur, and the general was disturbed. He noted that General Sutherland often got off on the wrong foot. He also corrected the impression Sutherland had given that MacArthur would not remain in command in Kyushu. MacArthur said he saw no reason for disagreement with Nimitz or the Navy. Kinkaid mentioned the Turner-Richardson unpleasantness at Saipan, and MacArthur suggested that Richardson was responsible. Kinkaid spoke of the difficulty of turning over army forces to MacArthur's command, and MacArthur seemed to be completely reasonable. The general said, of course, it is not possible now to turn over to him the control of army forces actually engaged in current operations. What he wanted was to get General Richardson and his staff into the MacArthur command, since they had been transferred to MacArthur and MacArthur's title had been changed to Commander-in-Chief of Army Forces, Pacific Theatre. At the end of June, Nimitz went back to the mainland again for meetings with King. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Japan, was very definitely in the schedule, and so tremendous a movement that it would have staggered an officer of the old pre-war Navy to consider. For example, no fewer than 9 amphibious groups would be employed under Admiral Turner, with 4 more in reserve. King and Nimitz talked of demobilization, of reorganization of the Pacific Fleet commands, and of relationships with the Russians and with the British. King still kept coming back to the idea of invading the China coast as a possible alternative to the invasion of the Tokyo Plain. By this time in the history of the Pacific War, the Navy had completely reversed itself in the matter of public relations. Captain Miller was to become Rear Admiral H.B. Miller and head of Navy Public Relations. Kelly Turner, who had refused to have a public relations officer on his ship in the Gilbert's operation, showed the change in a letter to Secretary Forrestal. In the Okinawa campaign, I think we have had a tremendous success from the public relations viewpoint. I have letters from 3 of the voice networks and from all of the major wire services thanking us for what has been given to them. Of course, this just didn't happen. Admiral Nimitz and his staff have pushed us hard to conform to your ideas as to news. My orders to everyone, as for 3 years, are that the Navy is owned by the American people and that the owners are entitled to know about us. Then I have had as Perot on my staff for this operation Paul Smith of the SF Chronicle, who is about the best newspaperman I know about. Even Terrible Turner was mellowing. Turner was busy, as always, planning for the invasion of Japan. He would take charge of the overall amphibious command, and he selected Vice Admiral Wilkinson to be his understudy, prepared to take over if my ship is hit and I can no longer function. This is going to be tough for all of us, and I hope you will give your best advice not only on the major organization, but also on the general plans for all parts of it. I do not intend to go into intricate details in my orders, but to decentralize as much as possible. Of course, I will issue general orders concerning the screen and various methods of protecting ships, but I do not intend to take charge of them myself, except as to coordination, but to assign responsibility for the various areas to you, Hill, Barbie, and Connolly. The headiness of victory was already in the air at home, and it had begun to create problems for the Pacific forces. Although the submarine force was at a peak in July 1945, the pressure was on Nimitz to give up the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, which the submariners had been using as a base for rest and recuperation between patrols. The civilians wanted their world back. In July, Nimitz and MacArthur were still trying to iron out difficulties in the matching of their commands and responsibilities. Nimitz suggested that MacArthur make his advance headquarters for the coming operations on Guam. "I can make available to you quarters identical with my own." But MacArthur had no intention of coming to a naval sphere of influence, and they continued their discussions by letter, by message, and by visits from members of the staffs. Nimitz's concern was the retention of command when the major responsibility for the Japanese invasion moved to MacArthur. It will undoubtedly become necessary in the future for fleet units, including carriers, to attack targets in the inland sea, and to operate not only in the Philippine Sea west of the 135th meridian, but also in the East China Sea, later in the Sea of Japan, and possibly also in the Yellow Sea, he told MacArthur. "I must retain complete freedom of action in such matters subject to the realities of the strategic and tactical situations as they develop." By mid-July, the command struggle had not been settled. Nimitz insisted on keeping his command of the Pacific Ocean areas and everything in it. MacArthur wanted to take over the army forces in the Pacific and give Nimitz the 7th Fleet and all naval forces. But Nimitz would not budge, so MacArthur would not budge either. Nimitz believed MacArthur was trying to take complete control of the operations against Japan, and MacArthur denied it, then complained to the Joint Chiefs of Staff that Nimitz would not cooperate. On July 17th, Kinkaid met with MacArthur and tried to resolve the dispute. "My estimate is that it all adds up to this," Kinkaid wrote Nimitz: "horse trading. He wants control of all my forces in the Central Pacific, and he believes that he will get proper support from the Navy by coordinated action." The matter remained unsettled. Late in July, the cruiser Indianapolis returned from the west coast, where she had been repaired following the kamikaze attack at Okinawa. She brought with her parts for the atomic bombs, which were being stockpiled in the Marianas. She came to Guam briefly and went out on a mission. She was between Guam and the Philippines when she was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Partly because of the split command, Guam was Sinkpak. Tacloban, where she was heading, was 7th Fleet. No one paid any attention to the non-arrival of the cruiser on her stipulated day. Meanwhile, she sank and her survivors floated in the sea for 84 hours before the oil slick of the cruiser attracted the attention of a patrol bomber. Only 316 men survived, nearly 900 died. Admiral Nimitz ordered a court of inquiry, and the captain of the Indianapolis was court-martialed. At Guam, in June and July 1945, Nimitz and Sherman prepared a plan for the occupation of the Tokyo Bay area by the 3rd Fleet, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed to the idea, since it would be several weeks before the army forces could be brought into action. MacArthur objected strenuously, however, on the grounds that the Navy could not handle the job, or perhaps because the Army and the Air Corps would be upset if the Navy moved in first. Now came a series of military-political discussions about the occupation of China, Korea, and Manchuria that are beyond the scope of this book, except to note that in these decisions rested much of the difficulty in which the world was to find itself in Asia for the next quarter-century. Quick decisions, some based on erroneous assumptions, were made at the highest military level, that of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, affecting Korea, Manchuria, North China, Netherlands, East Indies, Malaya, and Indochina. The demand on the Japanese for unconditional surrender and the total collapse of Japanese power in these areas, with no orderly plan for government, brought about a state of almost unlimited chaos. Such considerations were simply beyond the command scope of the Pacific Fleet. It was difficult enough for Nimitz and MacArthur, with their differing philosophies of the war, to reach agreement on the occupation. MacArthur, for example, claimed then and thereafter that the Central Pacific Campaign was expensive and wasteful in lives. At Okinawa, he said, the Japanese sank 36 ships, damaged 368, and destroyed 800 American planes. These figures exceed the entire American losses in the SWPA from Melbourne to Tokyo. Again, the problem of command had arisen. It would not be solved in this war, for events began moving much too rapidly. On August 1st, Admiral Halsey was busy avoiding a new typhoon, but ready to operate against the Japanese islands as the weather bettered. On August 6th, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Then came the second A-bomb dropped on Nagasaki. When Nimitz had the news, he was deeply shocked. He had known for some time about the weapon, but no one knew precisely what it could do. Halsey was shocked too. "I am looking forward to seeing you," Halsey wrote on August 9th, "and am anxious to hear what you can tell me about this appalling new weapon and about future developments." The results were still obscure, but the developments came quickly. The Russians declared war on Japan. On August 10th, King sent Nimitz a message. "This is a peace warning," it began, then went on to state that Japan was ready to surrender. A few days later, Japan did agree to unconditional surrender. On August 13th, Admiral Sherman was in Manila, conferring with MacArthur. The general's policy had stiffened completely, as Sherman reported to Nimitz. He considers that as Supreme Allied Commander he is now fully responsible for and commands all phases of the occupation of Japan. He desires no communication with Japanese authorities by forces in the Pacific except through his headquarters. He expects to summon Japanese representatives to Manila to make a preliminary arrangement for the surrender. He reiterated in most emphatic terms his disapproval of the use of a fleet landing force prior to the clearance of Japanese forces from the area under armistice arrangements. This disapproval is based both on military grounds and effect on service relationships. And so the war ended, a very different war from the one that had begun on December 7th, 1941. The Japanese, fearing a growing American military power and refusal to accept their expansion in East Asia and the Pacific Ocean, had attacked swiftly to break American naval power. The Japanese intent was to consolidate a Pacific empire before the Americans could move, and to inflict enough defeats on the United States and her allies in this period to cause them to make a peace that gave the Japanese what they wanted in the Pacific. The first part of the Japanese plan had succeeded only too well. American power was destroyed at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese went on to victories in the Philippines and on the shores of the China Seas that surprised even the Japanese High Command with their ease and swiftness. But there was an element missing. The Japanese had not gotten the American carriers, and armed with these weapons, supported by cruisers and destroyers, and manned by determined and angry men, the American Navy set out to avenge the disgrace of Pearl Harbor. In the South Pacific, the Americans and the Australians gained a foothold when they decided that the Japanese must be stopped at the Solomons. The struggle there was desperate, for the Japanese position was in many ways stronger than the Allied. The Japanese had air power at hand through their island chain, and their fleet units were better disposed and better trained in the beginning than the American and the Australian. From the South Pacific, the real battle against Japan moved to the Central Pacific and the submarine campaign. General MacArthur took some territory, but his victories in this period served largely to keep the Japanese off balance and to occupy certain forces. The war was being won by submarines and the Central Pacific forces. The casualty figures showed that much. It was the Nimitz command that fought the battles and took the territory essential to the maintenance of the Japanese Empire, as it had been planned to exist after 1942. In 1943, the gallant men of the submarines and the surface fleet, the carriers and the assault forces carried the war. Meanwhile, more and better carriers, submarines and other ships were being built at furious speed on the coasts of America. In 1944, they began coming in force to the Pacific, and along with them came thousands of men who had been civilians a short time before and were now deep-water sailors. Some of these men sailed directly from American ports into battle, never having been across the sea before, an immense tribute to the American Reserve Navy. By 1944, the handwriting was on the wall for any gloomy Japanese admiral to read. There were too many ships, too many planes, too many guns, too many submarines, too many troops coming ashore in too many transports, and the island empire simply could not withstand the pressure for long. No matter how gallant the Japanese, they could not bring their iron and coal and special metals to Japan if the ships were sunk, and the ships were sunk by the dozens and the hundreds. So the gun factories and the shell factories and the airplane factories began to go idle as the overwhelming American might was brought to crush Japan. In 1945, Germany was defeated, and then the whole of Western Allied power could be turned against Japan. Britain was able and eager to bring her fleets to the Pacific to show the Union Jack and recover the prestige lost in the fall of Singapore and the sinking of the great battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales. By the summer of 1945, scarcely a ship could sail from the far reaches of the Japanese Empire and hope to reach the Central Islands. American submarines were penetrating the inland sea regularly and without fear. When the atomic bomb came, Japan was already virtually defeated. The Navy men said she was defeated, and what remained was to pick up the piece and stage manage the surrender. The A-bombs were the spectacular weapons, but it was certain that Japan was beaten by the overwhelming industrial might of the United States, and that the A-bomb simply allowed the Americans to take over Japan and force the debatable policy of unconditional surrender down the Japanese throats without further American bloodshed. The formal Japanese surrender was signed aboard Admiral Halsey's flagship, the battleship Missouri, and nearly every general and admiral alive who had played a significant part in the Pacific War was invited, with the exception of Holland Smith. When the occupation began, Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had a role to play, Hokkaido, and so did nearly all others. Admiral Harry Hill noted the oversight and, in a message to Nimitz, suggested that he would be pleased to have Holland Smith as his guest when Hill moved in to deliver his share of the occupation forces. "Negative," came the answer from Admiral Nimitz. That was the only really sour note. There was a sad note. 4 days after the surrender, Admiral McCain died of a heart attack, the first of Nimitz's admirals to go since Admiral Henry Mullinix on the Liscombe Bay at the Gilberts, not counting Willis A. Lee, who died of a heart attack on August 25, 1945, but who was not in the Pacific at the moment. So Nimitz and his admirals had come to the natural end of the line without solving the problem of command between Army and Navy. The problem would continue and still be debated between Army and Navy commanders a quarter of a century later, whether the theatre command or the unified command system was more workable. Nimitz continued on as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet in the summer and fall of 1945. Admiral Halsey, the ebullient fighter, stayed in the public eye. He occupied Yokosuka Naval Base. Once he had boasted that he would ride Emperor Hirohito's white horse down the streets of Tokyo. Now he was persuaded to board a white horse, and Americans smiled at the didos of one of their favorite heroes. He came home to a hero's welcome, to receive a gold star in lieu of a 4th Distinguished Service Medal, and to retire with the rank of Fleet Admiral. Even at the end, Halsey was his old self, outspoken and in trouble. He spoke out flatly against the use of the atomic bomb, blaming the scientists who had worked on it as much as the politicians. The scientists took umbrage. A representative of the Federation of American Scientists demanded a retraction or a disavowal of Halsey's statements. Nimitz replied soothingly, also in character. "I hope that Admiral Halsey's clarifying press statement will inform the public of his real intentions in this matter," said Nimitz, "and that our scientists will continue to accept him as the heroic and indomitable naval leader that he is. It would be most unfortunate for a rift to develop between the personnel of the Navy and the scientists of this country, whose work is so essential to our progress." But as far as the Navy was concerned, Halsey had come to the end of his career. He was a fighting admiral, and the Pacific War had shown him at his finest, with all his faults. He was one of the great naval figures of all time, and his contributions to the Pacific victory in the early days of the war and in the South Pacific Campaign endeared him past criticism to Chester W. Nimitz. Halsey knew that the path for him was retirement, and he left the active service with an easy heart. Spruance relieved Halsey as commander of the fleet, which once again became Fifth Fleet. Kelly Turner retired after some time as U.S. representative to the UN. Harry Hill organized and commanded a brand new National War College, which was organized because in the vast expansion of the services, Army and Navy war colleges could not handle the task of training officers for command. Admiral Towers finally got his sea command. He replaced McCain as commander of the fast carrier task forces. Mitchell went to Washington to become Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Air. Among the others, Admiral Kimmel never secured the public vindication he sought almost until his death, a sad story of a man whose career was sacrificed. Yet it was the Navy way. A captain may not go down with his ship in the 20th century, but his career usually does. Admiral Pye had been at the Naval War College. He retired. Admiral Fletcher became chairman of the General Board until retirement in 1947. Admiral Dremel continued at the Philadelphia Navy Yard and retired in 1946. Admiral Brown was relieved as aide to the President after Franklin Roosevelt died, then went to the Bureau of Personnel until he retired shortly after the Japanese surrender. Admiral Gormley's career recovered considerably in the last months of the war. He had been the victim of confusion and change, given a huge command and multifarious responsibilities in the South Pacific, from diplomatic to logistic. When the fighting became desperate at Guadalcanal, he was simply overwhelmed and did not respond quickly enough to suit Nimitz, who nevertheless had great respect for Gormley's abilities. Those abilities carried him to become commander of American naval forces in Germany in 1944, and to supervise the demilitarization of the German Navy and to act as a diplomat. He did an outstanding job and was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, then was appointed to the General Board of the Navy. Admiral Fitch left the office of Chief of Naval Operations to become the first aviator superintendent of the United States Naval Academy. He established the Department of Aeronautics there. He served later in the office of the Undersecretary of the Navy and then retired in 1947. Hill was superintendent until 1952. Admiral Hoover replaced Admiral Towers in Pearl Harbor when Towers went to the task force. He served for several months at Pearl Harbor and then returned to the United States. As for Admiral Nimitz, his post-war career was more difficult than might be imagined. He came home a hero in the fall of 1945 and was feted in Texas and elsewhere. But there were problems. The principal problem was a tension that existed between Nimitz and Secretary Forrestal. Actually, Forrestal did not want Nimitz to become Chief of Naval Operations, the one post to which Nimitz aspired. In October the matter came to a head, as the Forrestal diaries indicate. The 6th of October 1945. Admiral Nimitz came in this morning. He said he hoped to relieve Admiral King. I told him my own view was that he could be of greater use and more effective to the Navy without being tied to the routine of such an exacting job as CNO. He replied that he was fully aware of how exacting it would be in the next 2 years, but in spite of that still wanted to do it, and said he was confident that both as regards relations with Congress, knowledge of the Navy, and support of the service, he could do a good job. The 10th of October 1945. I spoke to Admiral Nimitz today about our conversation. I said that if he wished to succeed King, that I would so recommend to the President with these qualifications. 1. That his staff should be mutually agreeable to the two of us, and 2. That his term be limited to 2 years, and 3. That he subscribe in general principle to the conception of the Navy Department organization as expressed in the new chart. So Nimitz did succeed King as Chief of Naval Operations when Admiral King retired at the end of the year. It was not altogether a happy assignment, for Nimitz and Forrestal did not like one another, and on Nimitz rested the problem of moving the Navy into the new Department of Defense single-service concept. There were incidents and there was unhappiness. Nimitz did not really want the job in some ways. He took it, he said, because he felt that if he was not given that job, it would hurt the morale of the Naval Officer Corps. Nimitz was relieved as commander of the Pacific Fleet by Admiral Spruance. Spruance then went on to the presidency of the Naval War College. Nimitz became relatively inactive after his term as Chief of Naval Operations, although as a fleet admiral he never retired. At the end of his Washington stay, he moved to San Francisco. In 1949 he was appointed administrator of the planned plebiscite in Kashmir, but it never materialized. He did spend some time on United Nations affairs and became a regent of the University of California. He was called upon for much speaking and writing, particularly of prefaces for books about the Pacific War. Many attempts were made to persuade him to write his memoirs, but he flatly refused. He had hoped that his son or one of his daughters would undertake a biography, but Chester Nimitz Jr. was busy with naval affairs and then joined the Perkin-Elmer Company of Norwalk, Connecticut, on his retirement as Rear Admiral and immersed himself in the business world. The daughters were busy with their own pursuits, one a Navy wife, one a nun, and one a scholar with the Rand Corporation. Nimitz lived quietly in a house near the university, and then moved into naval quarters at the naval station on Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay, where he lived even more quietly until his death in 1966. Then he was buried in Golden Gate National Cemetery, next to Kelly Turner. Later, Charles Lockwood was buried there. In 1969, Raymond Spruance joined them, above the wide Pacific, where they had fought so gloriously. Spruance had retired as president of the Naval War College after a distinguished tenure, although he never achieved the 5-star rank he wanted and deserved. Nimitz had recommended Spruance for the honor, but Congress after World War II reverted to its arm's-length treatment of the military. Spruance was honored, however, by an appointment as ambassador to the Philippines, and served there with distinction until 1955. As for the other men, they had their ups and downs, as always happens in the peacetime service. Admiral Towers followed Spruance as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, then went to the General Board for a time, and finally ended his career as a Vice President of Pan American World Airways. Admiral Lockwood, the submarine commander, enjoyed a very successful post-war career as a popular author of books on submarines. Admiral Jocko Clark, who believed he had engineered the replacement of Admiral Pownall as commander of fast carriers, was subjected to a Jovian revenge. His next assignment was to a training command under Pownall. The first years after the war were marred for Nimitz and his admirals by the controversy over unification of the services. Nimitz opposed unification to the point where he, on the one side, and Secretary Forrestal and President Truman were very nearly at an impasse. Nimitz had brought Forrest Sherman in as his Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, and they worked together. Admiral Radford worked with them. He was Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air in those days. But the matter degenerated into squabbles that aroused irritations. The Nimitz admirals, old and young, did not have an easy time of it, although several of the younger men went on to very distinguished careers. W. H. Blandy became commander of the Atlantic Fleet, Forrest Sherman became Chief of Naval Operations, Arthur Radford commanded the Pacific Fleet and was later chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Jocko Clark commanded the 7th Fleet that fought the Korean War. Such different men. Clark, one might say, was a more modern Halsey, flamboyant and opinionated, but a fighter every inch. Radford, like Sherman, was a thinker. Sherman, somewhat like Spruance, was a strategist and a cool-headed fighter. Each was an individual. Sometimes it seemed remarkable that so many individuals of such different temperaments could be welded into a fighting team at all. There, of course, were the secrets of the principal admirals, Halsey, Spruance, and Nimitz. Halsey instilled in his men a fierce loyalty that was totally reciprocated. He was the favourite of the sailors of the fleet and of the people of the United States. Captain Harold Hopkins, a British liaison officer with the fleet, compared Halsey to Beatty, the British sea dog of World War I who fought at Jutland, or to Horatio Nelson or John Paul Jones. Spruance was the Jellicoe, the thoughtful commander with his eye on the campaign, not the battle. But finally, when it was said and done, it all came back to Nimitz, the blue-eyed, gentle Nimitz, hard as nails underneath, the professional naval officer who knew best of all how to get optimum performance from his major weapon, men. Nimitz shared with that great soldier, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a disarming and almost misleading appearance of ordinariness and diffidence. Like Eisenhower, Nimitz was a master at delegation of authority. Nimitz had a quality unique to himself too. There was always a sense of urgency and special responsibility to his delegations of authority. He wanted action, immediate, appropriate, and resultful action, and he nearly always got it. One can see the tremendous responsibility he gave Halsey and Spruance in the operation of the fleets, and the equal responsibility delegated to Lockwood in the submarines. The torpedo question, for example, was vital to the winning of the war. Nimitz and Lockwood conferred on the problem of the erratic performance and duds, and when Lockwood indicated that he suspected the source, and was working hard at locating the specific areas of difficulty and pushing the development of an electric torpedo to substitute for the faulty weapon if need be, then Nimitz, the old submarine officer, saw that Lockwood was doing everything he himself might have done, and he relegated the problem to the back of his mind and turned to immediate issues that he alone could resolve. Or take the matter of amphibious warfare. To be sure, Major General Holland Smith of the Marine Corps knew a great deal about amphibious warfare at the beginning of the war. It had been a specialty of his in the days before, as the art was being worked out. But few others knew much about amphibious warfare, especially top naval officers. It was Nimitz's genius that led him to search out Kelly Turner's mind when Turner was assigned by King to this task, and then to discover that Turner had a special aptitude for the work, and to accept Turner's judgments within the area of his competence. He let Turner pick his men, and let Turner have his head. The result was the development of amphibious warfare in the Pacific quickly and efficiently, to reach new dimensions, or take carrier warfare. Nimitz knew so little about air affairs and carrier warfare that Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman was callous enough to suggest in a letter that the Commander-in-Chief be replaced by an Air Admiral. And yet Nimitz was the one who shepherded the discussions of air power and use of the air forces in the Pacific. Under his command, the modernization of the tactics of carrier warfare took on new dimensions. It was not simply coincidental that the carrier men expanded and perfected their thinking in the Pacific. It was because Admiral Nimitz had the good sense to see that these young, eager specialists could do the job if they were given the responsibility and authority, and he gave it to them. In the files of the Naval War College, there exists a letter from Admiral Nimitz stating that all he knew about strategy he picked up at the college, and of course this was a little bit of icing on the cake, but the fact is that the War College battles did give him a basis for his thinking, just as King, Spruance and Halsey learned their lessons there. But there was a good deal more to command than prefabricated strategy. The Japanese had their equivalent of the War College too. Nimitz's great strength was his ability to coax the very best from others. In a way, his wardroom stories summed him up. He told them with the sure knowledge that they would go down the line and be repeated by the men on the lower decks of the ships of the fleet. One could say that Halsey was the man to win a battle for you, Spruance was the man to win a campaign, but Nimitz was the man to win a war.